Stop trying to be understood. Most people aren't listening. You explain yourself. You choose your words carefully. You stay calm. You try to be reasonable, clear, measured. And still, somehow, the person in front of you walks away with a version of you that doesn't exist. That moment, you know it. The pause after you finish speaking, the response that tells you instantly that nothing you said actually landed, not even close. And instead of frustration, what rises first is something quieter, a kind of exhaustion, a slow, heavy thought. Why do I even try? Most people at that point do one thing. They try harder. They add more words, more context, more emotion. They reach for a different angle, a better explanation, a clearer example, as if the problem were the sentence, and not something much deeper. But what if trying harder is exactly what's keeping you stuck? This video is not about communication skills. It's not about how to speak more clearly or listen more actively. What we're going to explore today goes further than that, and it's going to be uncomfortable in a very specific way, because it touches something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The need to be understood is not just a preference. For most people, it functions like a requirement, an invisible condition for feeling safe, seen, and real. And when that condition isn't met, when the explanation fails, when the words fall flat, when the version of you that reaches the other person bears no resemblance to who you actually are, something inside doesn't just feel frustrated, it feels erased. That feeling is what this video is really about. Not the misunderstanding itself, but what happens inside you when it keeps occurring. The slow erosion, the quiet self-editing. The subtle way you begin reshaping your words, your tone, even your thoughts, just to fit inside someone else's perception. And by the end of this video, something is going to shift. Not because you'll learn how to be understood better, but because you'll understand why that chase was costing you far more than you realized. The Stoics saw this clearly. Epictetus, a man who spent years as a slave before becoming one of the most influential philosophers in history, taught one foundational principle that cuts through all of this. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. What you say, within your control. How it's received, never was. That sounds simple, but living it is something else entirely. So before we go further, ask yourself this honestly. When was the last time you felt truly understood? And more importantly, how much of yourself did you change just trying to get there? You're not being ignored, you're being processed wrong. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. People are listening, that's not the problem. The problem is what happens to your words the moment they enter someone else's mind. Every person you've ever spoken to carries an internal world, a system built from years of experience, pain, assumption, and identity, and that system doesn't receive information neutrally. It filters it, it edits it, it runs everything you say through a pre-existing narrative, and what comes out the other side is rarely what you put in. So when you feel unseen, it's not because the other person wasn't paying attention. It's because they were paying attention through a lens that was already focused on something else. A version of you they decided on long before you opened your mouth. This is what psychology calls a perception lock. Once someone forms a fixed image of who you are, new information doesn't update that image. It gets absorbed into it, distorted to fit, or quietly discarded. You can explain yourself 10 different ways, and each explanation will be processed through the same filter. That's why the harder you try, the more confused you become, because you're measuring the wrong thing. You're measuring clarity when the real variable is perception. There's a moment that captures this exactly. You finish saying something important, something real. You pause, and the other person responds, not to what you said, but to what they expected you to say. And you stand there, watching your words get rearranged into a version you don't recognize. That's not a failure of language. That's a collision of internal worlds. And once you see that, Once you understand that the filter exists and that it is not yours to dismantle, a more unsettling question surfaces. If perception is already locked, what exactly are you trying to change when you keep explaining? And more importantly, what does it cost you every time you try? The invisible contract you never signed. Somewhere, without anyone telling you, you adopted a belief. A quiet agreement with yourself that went something like this: if I explain myself well enough, I will be understood. It feels rational, even fair, like a basic rule of human exchange, effort in, comprehension out. And because it feels fair, you held on to it. You built habits around it. You shaped the way you speak, the way you defend yourself, the way you enter difficult conversations, all of it resting on this one silent assumption. But that assumption has a flaw that most people never examine. It treats the other person as a neutral receiver, an empty space waiting to be filled with your meaning. And people are not that. They never were. Carl Jung spent decades studying the way human beings project their inner world onto the people around them. What he found was not flattering. People don't see you as you are. They see you as they are. Your words pass through their fears, their wounds, their unresolved narratives, and what they hear is shaped more by their internal landscape than by anything you actually said. You're not speaking into open space. You're speaking into someone's history. And that history edits you without asking permission. So the contract you believed in, explain clearly, be understood, was never real. Not because people are malicious, but because the system itself doesn't work the way you assumed. Understanding is not a reward for clarity. It's a byproduct of alignment. And alignment cannot be forced. This is the part that stings. Because if the contract was never real, then every time you felt like a failure for not being understood, that shame belonged to a broken premise, not to you. You were negotiating with a system you didn't design and couldn't control. And the more you invested in that negotiation, the more of yourself you placed into hands that were never equipped to hold it. But if the contract is broken, why does it still feel so personal when it fails? Why it hurts more than it should? Being misunderstood is not just frustrating. For most people, it lands somewhere much deeper than frustration. It lands in identity, and that changes everything. When you try to make someone understand you, you are not just transmitting information. You are trying to transmit yourself, your intentions, your reality, your internal world. So when that transmission fails, it doesn't feel like a failed sentence, it feels like a failed person. That's why the sting is disproportionate. That's why a single misreading from someone you respect can sit with you for days. That's why you replay the conversation, adjusting, correcting, imagining a version where it went differently. Because something more than a message was rejected. There's a specific internal silence that follows being misunderstood. A pause where two competing thoughts collide. Am I not expressing myself well enough? Or are they just not seeing me? That question sounds simple, but it isn't. Because one answer points outward and the other turns inward. And the inward one is dangerous, because the moment you begin doubting your own clarity, not as a one-time question, but as a pattern, something starts to shift. You begin editing, not your words, but yourself. You soften the edges of your thoughts. You adjust the tone before you've even begun. You reshape the message to anticipate the misreading, and in doing so, you slowly move away from what you actually wanted to say. This is one of the quietest forms of self-erasure. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It accumulates. Each small adjustment feels like wisdom, like social intelligence, like maturity. But underneath it, something is contracting. The Stoics named this dynamic with precision. Epictetus in the Enchiridion warned against placing your well-being in the hands of external judgment, not because other people don't matter, but because anchoring your sense of self to their perception is the beginning of a particular kind of suffering, one that has no flaw. Because there will always be someone who doesn't understand you. Always. So if the wound goes this deep, if misunderstanding touches identity itself, then the real work isn't about communication at all. It's about something much closer to home, the trap of over-explaining. There is a behavior that feels like effort, but functions like surrender, and most people who do it have no idea it's happening. Over-explaining. The moment you add one more sentence, then another, then a justification for the justification. Each addition feels responsible, like you're being thorough, like you're preventing misunderstanding. But what you're actually doing is broadcasting something the other person receives long before they process your words. Desperation. Not the dramatic kind, the subtle kind. The kind that lives in the extra clause, in the apologetic tone, in the way you circle back to something you already said just to make sure it landed. And people feel that, not consciously, not analytically, but instinctively. The more you reach for understanding, the less authority your presence carries. Because certainty doesn't chase, and when your words are chasing, something in the listener pulls back. You've lived this moment. You start explaining something straightforward, then you sense it isn't landing. So you add more. You bring in a different angle. You use an analogy, then another one. And somewhere in the middle of all that effort, you lose the thread entirely. And you hear yourself saying something that no longer resembles what you meant when you started. I had this completely clear in my head. Why does it sound so uncertain now? Because clarity doesn't survive desperation. The more you need the other person to understand, the more that need contaminates the message itself. What began as a clear thought becomes a negotiation, and negotiations, by definition, signal that you're not sure you have the right to what you're asking for. Epictetus addresses this directly. In the Enchiridion, chapter 1, he draws a line between what belongs to us and what does not. Our words, our reasoning, our intentions, these belong to us. The reception, the interpretation, the judgment, these never did. And the moment we begin adjusting our expression to control the reception, we have already crossed into territory we were never meant to occupy. Over-explaining is that crossing. It is the moment you trade your internal clarity for the hope of external confirmation. And the trade is never equal. You give up something real, your groundedness, your authority, your alignment, in exchange for something that was never guaranteed to begin with. So the question worth sitting with is not how to explain better. The real question is harder than that. Why do you need this particular person in this particular moment to carry a version of you that matches who you know yourself to be? Most people aren't listening. They're waiting. Real listening is one of the rarest things you will encounter in a human life. Not because people are indifferent, but because genuine listening requires something most people are not trained to offer: full presence without an agenda. What most people do instead is wait. They wait to respond. They wait to defend. They wait to confirm what they already believe. And while you're still speaking, they're already composing. This is not malice. It's mechanics. The human mind under social pressure defaults to self-protection, to reaction, to the management of its own narrative. And when someone is managing their own narrative, they cannot simultaneously receive yours. So when you speak, truly speak, from something real, you are often speaking into a space that is already occupied. The other person is there, physically present, eyes on you. But internally, they are elsewhere, preparing, defending, categorizing. And what reaches them is not your message. It's a fragment of it, filtered through whatever they were already thinking before you began. You feel this instantly when it happens. There's a texture to it, a subtle disconnect, like reaching out and touching glass instead of a hand. The conversation continues, the words keep moving, but something essential is missing. Contact, real contact. And part of you knows, even as you keep talking, they're not here with me. Yet you continue. Because another part of you believes that if you say it just right, if you find the exact combination of words and tone and timing, something will shift. The glass will dissolve. They'll actually arrive. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And this, applied here, cuts sharply. The version of connection you're working toward, where they finally understand, where the glass disappears, may be entirely imaginary. Not because connection is impossible, but because it cannot be manufactured through better explanation. Real understanding between two people does not happen because one of them found the right words. It happens when both are present, when both have set down their internal noise long enough to actually meet, and that is not something you can produce alone, no matter how precisely you speak. So the question that follows is the one most people avoid. If attention, not clarity, is what creates real understanding, then what are you actually responsible for in this exchange? And what were you never responsible for, no matter how hard you tried? The illusion of control over perception. You control what you say. You do not control how it lands. That distinction sounds obvious, almost too simple to be worth stating. But the gap between knowing it intellectually and actually living it, that gap is where most of the suffering lives. Because somewhere beneath the surface, there is a belief that effort should translate into outcome. That if you are careful enough, precise enough, emotionally intelligent enough, you can shape how you are received. You can manage the impression, guide the interpretation. This belief is not irrational. In some contexts, it's even partially true. Clarity helps, tone matters, timing makes a difference, but there is a ceiling, and most people never acknowledge it. Because acknowledging it means accepting something deeply uncomfortable, that your best effort does not guarantee understanding, that you can do everything right and still be misread, that the final step, how your words are received, belongs entirely to someone else. Marcus Aurelius returned to this principle throughout the Meditations. In Book 2, he reminds himself that the people he will encounter will be ungrateful, violent, deceitful, not as a reason to withdraw, but as a reason to stop expecting the external world to cooperate with his internal intentions. He was not pessimistic, he was precise. He understood that his domain ended at the boundary of his own mind, and he guarded that boundary with discipline. What happens when you truly internalize this is that something in the body actually changes. The tension that lives in explanation, in the careful construction of sentences designed to produce a specific reaction, begins to release. Because you are no longer performing, you are no longer building a case, you are simply expressing, from alignment, from your actual position, without the underlying anxiety of managing what happens next. That shift feels unfamiliar at first, almost irresponsible. Because so much of social life is built on the assumption that we are supposed to manage how we are perceived. But what you are actually abandoning is the illusion. The idea that perception was ever yours to control. It wasn't. It never was. And the energy you spent maintaining that illusion, the careful editing, the constant calibration, the quiet performance, that energy belonged to you. The question now is what becomes possible the moment you stop pretending you did. When you stop explaining, people get uncomfortable. There is something that happens when you stop over-explaining, something that most people are not prepared for, because it doesn't feel like relief, at least not at first. It feels like exposure. When you withdraw the constant stream of justification and context, you leave a silence, and silence in most social environments is not neutral. It creates pressure. People expect explanation. They've been conditioned to receive it. And when it doesn't come, something activates in them. a discomfort, an uncertainty, a need to fill the gap, so they fill it themselves, with assumption, with projection, with whatever narrative makes the most sense to their internal world, and the version of you that emerges from that process is often further from the truth than anything a misunderstood explanation would have produced. You will feel this. There will be a moment, specific, not abstract, where someone has gotten you completely wrong, where the story they've constructed about your silence is so far from your reality that something inside you wants to correct it immediately, to speak, to explain, to make it right. And you will choose not to. That choice is one of the hardest things a person can practice. Not because the explanation would be wrong, but because you now understand something the other person doesn't. You understand that the explanation would not fix the misreading. It would simply add more material for the filter to distort. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, chapter 25, speaks directly to this. He warns against seeking the good opinion of others as a measure of your own conduct. Not because reputation is irrelevant, but because anchoring your actions to others' approval is a form of enslavement, a voluntary one, the kind where you hand someone the key to your peace and then wonder why you feel imprisoned. Restraint, practiced consciously, is not passivity. It is not indifference. It is a form of authority, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. When you stop filling every silence with justification, you stop signaling that you need permission. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes the entire texture of how you move through interactions. The discomfort others feel in your silence is real, but it is theirs. It belongs to their expectation that you will continue performing for their understanding. And the moment you recognize that their discomfort is not your responsibility to resolve, something opens, a different kind of clarity, one that doesn't depend on anyone else's reaction to exist. The discipline of selective expression. Not everything deserves words. Not everyone deserves access to your internal world. And learning to tell the difference, that is not coldness. That is one of the most honest things you can develop. Most people operate from a default of openness. They share because sharing feels connecting. They explain because explanation feels responsible. They justify because silence feels like guilt. And underneath all of it runs an assumption that expression is always better than withholding. But expression without discernment is not honesty, it is exposure. And there is a significant difference between the two. Honesty means saying what is true. Exposure means offering what is true to people who are not equipped, or not willing, to receive it with care. When you offer the real parts of yourself to someone operating from projection, from a fixed narrative about who you are not building connection. You are providing material for misreading. You already know who these people are. You feel it in the aftermath of every conversation. That specific exhaustion that has nothing to do with the length of the exchange and everything to do with its quality. You leave more confused than when you arrived. You find yourself questioning things that were clear before the conversation began. That is not connection. That is friction wearing the costume of communication. Selective expression means developing the awareness to recognize that pattern before you enter it, not after. It means understanding that your words carry weight, and that weight deserves a surface capable of receiving it. Not every person, not every moment. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the discipline of keeping one's inner world protected from unnecessary disturbance. Not isolation, integrity. The practice of maintaining the coherence of your internal state by being intentional about what you allow in and what you send out. Selective expression is that practice applied to speech. It asks you to pause before the words come, not to censor yourself, but to ask honestly, is this the right moment, and is this the right person? If the answer to either question is uncertain, the discipline is to wait. Not forever, not out of fear, but long enough to know that what you're about to offer has a real chance of mattering. Because here is what becomes available when you stop speaking by default. Your words begin to carry a different weight. People notice when someone speaks with intention rather than compulsion. They feel the difference between words that come from clarity and words that come from need. And that difference, invisible as it is, changes how they receive what you say. Which leads to something most people find genuinely surprising, because the natural assumption is that speaking less means being understood less. But the opposite, more often, is true. You don't need to be understood to be certain. There is a kind of certainty that doesn't require a witness. Most people have never experienced it, not because they lack clarity, but because they've been measuring clarity by the wrong instrument. They've been checking their own understanding against other people's agreement. If someone gets it, if someone nods, if someone reflects back what you meant, then you know you were clear. And if they don't, then doubt enters. Not just about the communication, about the thought itself. This is the dependency that runs beneath so many conversations, not the desire to be heard, but the need for external confirmation to feel internally certain. And that dependency reveals something sobering. You have been outsourcing your own clarity to people who were never qualified to hold it. Certainty that requires agreement is not certainty. It is consensus. And consensus is a social phenomenon, not an epistemological one. It tells you what a group of people believe at a given moment. It tells you nothing about what is actually true, or about what you actually know. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, chapter 48, draws a sharp line between the person who seeks validation from the crowd and the person who has developed what he calls the inner citadel, a place of judgment that does not move based on external pressure. Not because external input is irrelevant, but because the foundation of one's reasoning cannot be built on something as unstable as other people's opinions. Internal coherence is what replaces the need for external validation. It's the feeling that your thoughts, your values, and your actions are aligned, that what you believe is consistent with how you live. When that alignment exists, something stabilizes, not rigidly, but in a way that doesn't collapse under the pressure of disagreement. You've felt the absence of this, the conversation where someone pushes back and suddenly you're not sure what you think anymore, not because they offered a compelling argument, but because their certainty was louder than yours. That is not an intellectual defeat. That is what happens when your sense of clarity is dependent on the reactions around you rather than rooted in something internal. Developing that root takes practice. It takes the willingness to hold a position quietly without performance, even when no one around you reflects it back. It takes the recognition that being alone in a clarity is not the same as being wrong, and it takes something the Stoics return to again and again, the discipline of examining your own reasoning with the same rigor you would apply to anything else, without needing the process to be witnessed or approved. Because here is the tension that emerges when you begin to actually live this. Certainty without external confirmation can feel, at first, indistinguishable from isolation. And that feeling, the quiet of standing in something no one else seems to see, is where most people lose their footing. Not because the clarity was wrong, but because the loneliness of it is something no philosophical principle fully prepares you for. The loneliness of clear thinking. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of seeing something clearly that the people around you cannot or will not see. It doesn't announce itself as loneliness at first. It arrives dressed as something else, as mild frustration, or as that quiet sense of disconnection in the middle of a conversation that should feel meaningful but doesn't. You're present, you're engaged, and still, something is missing. A real meeting. A moment where what you understand and what the other person understands actually occupy the same space. You start noticing patterns, the way certain conversations circle back to the same point without ever advancing, the way emotional reactions replace genuine inquiry, the way people defend positions not because they've examined them, but because those positions are part of who they believe themselves to be. You see the mechanics of it, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. That visibility changes you, not in the sense of superiority. That is a misreading of what clarity actually does. It changes you in the sense of distance. Conversations that used to feel urgent begin to feel predictable. Conflicts that used to pull you in begin to reveal themselves as patterns you've already mapped. And in that distance, something unexpected arrives, a kind of internal quiet that is not peace, not yet, but is the beginning of it. The recognition that most of what people project onto you, most of what they misread and distort and react to, is a conversation they are having with themselves. You just happen to be standing in front of them when it started. Marcus Aurelius sat with this reality for years. The Meditations, his private journal never intended for anyone else's eyes, is in large part a record of a man trying to maintain clarity in an environment almost entirely hostile to it. In Book 4, he writes about retreating into himself, not as escape but as return, the recognition that the most reliable place of order in a world of constant noise is the interior. But here is what the Meditations also reveal, between the lines. Marcus was lonely in his clarity. Surrounded by an empire, by advisors and philosophers, he still wrote alone at night, reminding himself of things he already knew because the world around him offered no reliable reflection of them. His clarity was real, and it isolated him in ways that philosophy could name but not fully resolve. This is the part most people skip when they talk about Stoic detachment. They present it as liberation, and it is. But liberation from one thing is always, simultaneously, a departure from something else. When you stop needing the noise, you also lose the comfort it provided, the distraction, the sense of being part of something immediate and shared. And what replaces it, at least initially, is a silence that takes time to learn how to inhabit. The question that lives inside that silence is worth facing directly. If clarity separates, if seeing more means connecting differently, then what does real connection look like from this side? The shift from being understood to understanding yourself. At some point, the question changes, not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation, but gradually the weight shifts. And when it does, everything that came before begins to look different. For a long time, the question was, how do I make them understand me? That question drove the explaining, the adjusting, the careful construction of sentences designed not just to communicate but to convince, to close the gap between who you are and who they think you are. And then, without a clear turning point, a different question begins to surface, almost as a whisper at first. Am I aligned with what I know to be true? That shift, from the outward question to the inward one, reorganizes everything. Because the outward question placed the measure of your clarity outside yourself, in someone else's comprehension. The inward question places it back where it always belonged, in the coherence between your thoughts, your values, and the way you actually live. This is what the Stoics called living according to nature. Not nature in the environmental sense, but in the sense of living in alignment with your rational capacity, your genuine understanding, your actual self. Epictetus describes the person who has stopped performing for external judgment as someone who has finally begun the real work, the work of examining their own interior with honesty and without apology. Expression, from this place, changes its character entirely. It becomes honest rather than strategic. You speak when something genuine needs to be said, not when anxiety about being misread pushes you to preemptively explain. You stay silent when silence is the more accurate response, not because you're afraid, but because you've already said what needed to be said inside yourself. There is a specific relief that arrives with this shift. It is not the relief of having resolved something, because nothing external has changed. People will still misread you. Conversations will still miss their mark. The relief is subtler than resolution. It is the relief of no longer measuring yourself against a standard that was never yours to meet. You've felt the absence of this relief in long stretches. The weight of maintaining a version of yourself for external consumption, adjusting, calibrating, editing in real time, is a form of labor that accumulates without announcement. You don't notice how tired it makes you until you stop. And when you stop, the silence that follows is not empty. It is full of something you had forgotten was there, yourself, unedited, not performing, not reaching, just present, in alignment, without the constant background negotiation of trying to be received correctly. And from that place, something becomes possible that was never possible before. Not the absence of misunderstanding, that remains, but the absence of its power over you. The misreading happens, and it no longer lands in the same place. Because the place it used to land, that tender, exposed need to be seen, has been replaced by something more stable, something internal, something that does not require another person's comprehension to remain intact. Which brings us to the final question, the one this entire video has been building toward. If you no longer need to be understood to feel certain, if your clarity no longer depends on how it's received, then what was all that effort really for? And what becomes available now that it's been set down? Final realization: you were never meant to be understood by everyone. Not everyone is supposed to understand you. That is not a failure of communication. It is not a flaw in your character. It is not something to be fixed, optimized, or overcome. It is simply true. And the moment you stop resisting that truth, the moment you let it settle rather than argue with it, something releases. Something that has been held tightly for a very long time, without you fully realizing how much energy the holding required. Think about what that energy was spent on. Every careful construction of a sentence designed to prevent misreading, every moment of replaying a conversation afterward, identifying the exact point where understanding slipped away. Every quiet contraction of yourself, the softening, the adjusting, the preemptive reshaping, performed in the service of fitting inside a perception that was never truly open to begin with. That was not connection, that was maintenance. And maintenance, sustained long enough, becomes indistinguishable from the relationship itself, until you stop and realize that what you were maintaining was never real to begin with. Real connection does not require explanation. It does not require the careful management of perception or the strategic deployment of vulnerability. Real connection, the kind that actually reaches another person, happens in resonance. Two people whose internal worlds, in a given moment, are genuinely aligned, not identical, not in agreement on everything, but aligned enough that what passes between them arrives without significant distortion. Resonance cannot be engineered. It can only be recognized. And one of the most important things you can do, for yourself and for the possibility of real connection, is to stop spending your energy trying to manufacture it with people who are not capable of it right now. Not because they are lesser, but because the alignment simply isn't there, and no amount of explanation will create what alignment alone can provide. Epictetus advises keeping your own company, internally, as the primary standard for your conduct. Not the company of those who approve of you, not the company of those who understand you, your own company, your own judgment, your own coherent interior. Marcus Aurelius lived this. He governed an empire while maintaining, in private, a conversation with himself that no one around him was equipped to have. He did not withdraw from relationship, but he knew, and his meditations make this unmistakably clear, that the most important understanding he would ever receive would not come from another person. It would come from within. So here is what this video was really about. Not how to be understood, not how to explain yourself more effectively. It was about something more fundamental than all of that. It was about returning to yourself, to the version of you that exists before the explaining begins, before the editing, before the quiet performance of trying to fit inside someone else's comprehension. That version of you does not need to be understood to be real. It does not need external confirmation to remain intact. It does not require anyone's comprehension to justify its clarity. And when you finally stop chasing understanding, when you set down the weight of that invisible contract and return to the only interior that was ever truly yours, what you find is not isolation. What you find is clarity. The kind that does not shake when it goes unwitnessed. The kind that does not shrink when it goes unrecognized. The kind that speaks when something real needs to be said and stays silent without apology when it doesn't. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to understand yourself, and that, fully lived, fully inhabited, is enough. It always was.